5 years had passed since the standoff above Valoran Prime, and the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The old Galactic Concord had collapsed under the weight of its own corruption, replaced by a new alliance built on principles of transparency and mutual aid. And at the center of this new order stood two species that had once been considered unimportant: the Volrini and the humans. Myra stood at a podium in the Great Hall of the Galactic Alliance, looking out at representatives from more than 200 species. Her pale blue skin was healthy now, no longer marked by the signs of illness that had once defined her people. Behind her, a massive screen displayed images from her recordings, humans landing on a dying world, doctors working through endless nights, children learning to smile again. She spoke in a clear, strong voice that carried across the hall and was broadcast to billions of beings across the stars. She told the story of the great abandonment and the even greater rescue that followed. She spoke of Lieutenant Grace Palmer, who had refused to leave despite every threat. She spoke of Dr. Nathan Cruz, whose determination had finally produced a cure for the plague. She spoke of Corporal Danny Webb, who had given hope to children who had never known hope before. And she spoke of humanity as a whole, the young species that everyone had dismissed as unimportant, the newcomers who did not understand how galactic politics worked, the naive idealists who believed that compassion was more important than power. Myra said that when the rest of the galaxy had calculated costs and benefits and turned away from the Volrini, humanity had done something different. They had simply asked themselves what was right, and then they had done it, no matter the consequences. They had risked their political future, their economic prosperity, and their very lives to help strangers they had never met. She paused and looked directly at the human delegation seated in the front row. Captain Grace Palmer was there, promoted twice since the crisis ended. Dr. Cruz sat beside her, now the director of the Galactic Medical Initiative that was bringing human and Volrini healing knowledge to every corner of the stars. Danny Webb was there too, no longer a corporal, but a teacher who traveled from world to world, showing children of every species how to play together. Mira said that her people had a new phrase that they taught their children. When young Volrini asked about the galaxy and whether it was safe to trust others, their parents told them a simple truth: the galaxy turned away from us. But humanity never did. The hall erupted in applause that lasted for several minutes. Mira stepped back from the podium with tears in her eyes, and Elder Corvith moved forward to take her place. The old Volrini had survived the plague and the crisis and lived to see his people begin to rebuild. His body was frail, but his spirit was stronger than ever. He spoke of the trials that had followed the revelation of the conspiracy. Former Corthan officials had faced justice for their crimes. Those who had helped cover up the truth had been exposed and removed from power. Ambassador Thelius, who had threatened humanity so confidently, was now serving a sentence for his role in the genocide. But Corvith also spoke of healing. He said that the Volrini had chosen not to seek revenge against the Corthan people as a whole. The crimes had been committed by leaders, not citizens. And the new Corthan government, led by those who had exposed the truth, had become one of the strongest supporters of the Galactic Alliance. He credited this spirit of reconciliation to the example set by humanity. He said that when humans first arrived on Valoran Prime, they had not asked about politics or history or who was responsible for what. They had simply seen suffering and chosen to help. They had shown the galaxy that it was possible to respond to cruelty with kindness, to answer hatred with love. On Valoran Prime itself, the transformation was visible everywhere. Cities that had been crumbling ruins 5 years ago were now being rebuilt with help from dozens of species. Gardens that had been dead and gray were now filled with flowers and the sound of children playing. Medical centers that had once stood empty were now treating patients from across the galaxy. staffed by Velrani and human doctors working side by side. The cure that Dr. Cruz had developed had saved millions of Velrani lives. But more importantly, the knowledge he had recovered from the ancient archives had been preserved and shared with the entire galaxy. The Velrani healing traditions that someone had tried to destroy were now being taught on 100 worlds. What had been intended as an ending had become a new beginning. On Earth, the crisis had changed humanity as well. The sacrifices made by Palmer and her crew had become legendary. Children learned about them in schools. Artists created works celebrating their courage. And a new generation of humans looked to the stars with a sense of purpose that had not existed before. Admiral Patricia Vance, now retired, gave an interview in which she was asked what the Velrani crisis had taught humanity about itself. She smiled and said that humans had always known who they were. They had always believed in helping others and standing up for what was right. The crisis had simply given them the chance to show the galaxy what they already knew in their hearts. Captain Palmer was asked a similar question at a ceremony honoring the anniversary of her crew's arrival on Velrani Prime. She stood in the rebuilt central plaza of the Velrani capital, surrounded by blue-skinned aliens who looked at her with gratitude and love. She said that when she had made the decision to stay, despite the Corthan threats, she had not been thinking about politics or history or legacy. She had simply been thinking about the faces of the sick children she had seen in the medical tents. She had been thinking about the old Velrani, who had lost everything but had still found the strength to hope. She said that humanity's greatest strength was not technology or military power or economic might. It was the simple ability to look at someone who was suffering and feel their pain. It was the refusal to turn away when turning away would be easier. It was the belief, carried in human hearts for thousands of years, that every life mattered and every being deserved compassion. Myra's final recording was made on the same day, in the same plaza. She stood where the human medical tents had once been, in a spot now marked by a monument carved from Velrani crystal. The monument showed human and Velrani figures standing together, their hands joined, their faces turned toward the stars. She spoke into her recording device one last time. She said that when historians of the future studied this era, they would see many things. They would see the fall of corrupt empires and the rise of new alliances. They would see scientific discoveries and political transformations. They would see wars ended and peace begun. But she hoped they would also see something else. She hoped they would see the moment when a small human ship landed on a dying world and changed everything. She hoped they would understand that the galaxy was not transformed by armies or technologies or great powers. It was transformed by ordinary people who refused to accept that cruelty was inevitable. The Velrani had a word for such people. It translated roughly as those who remember. Those who remember that kindness matters. Those who remember that suffering calls out for relief. Those who remember that every being in the universe is connected to every other being by bonds of shared existence. Mira said that before the humans came, her people had begun to forget that such beings existed. They had looked at the cold stars and seen only indifference. But the humans had reminded them of the truth. The humans had shown them that the darkness of space was not empty. It was filled with light, if only one had the courage to look for it. She ended her recording with words that would be carved on monuments and taught to children for generations to come. She said that when the galaxy turned away from the Velrani, it had made a terrible choice. But humanity had made a different choice. Humanity had looked at a dying world and seen not a burden but a responsibility. They had seen not strangers but family, and they had stayed. Myra looked up at the stars that had once seemed so cold and so far away. They seemed warmer now. They seemed closer. And somewhere out there, she knew human ships were still traveling, still searching, still ready to help whoever needed them, because that was who they were. That was who they had always been. And that was who they would always be. The Velrani would never forget. The second broadcast shattered the careful silence that had protected the guilty for 30 years. Dr. Nathan Cruz presented the documents he had found. The communications between Corthan officials that proved the plague was no accident. Lieutenant Grace Palmer stood beside him as the evidence scrolled across screens on 1,000 worlds. And across the galaxy, billions of beings watched in horror as the truth was finally revealed. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. On the Corthan homeworld, crowds gathered outside government buildings demanding answers. On a dozen other planets, citizens who had believed the official story about the Velrani quarantine now questioned everything they had been told. And in the halls of the Galactic Concord, old alliances began to crack under the weight of shared guilt. Myra recorded everything from her place aboard the Hopeful Dawn. Her recordings had spread far beyond Velrun Prime now. Beings from across the galaxy watched her documentation of human kindness and Velrani suffering. They saw Corporal Danny Webb playing with sick children. They saw Dr. Cruz working through endless nights to save lives. They saw Lieutenant Palmer standing firm against threats from one of the most powerful empires in existence. But the Corthans did not accept their exposure quietly. Ambassador Thelius appeared on galactic communication networks to denounce the evidence as fabricated. He claimed that humanity had created fake documents to turn the galaxy against the Corthan Empire. He called the humans dangerous manipulators who were trying to destabilize galactic order for their own benefit. And then he announced that the Corthan Navy was dispatching a fleet to Velrun Prime. He said the purpose was to enforce the original quarantine and protect the galaxy from the plague. But everyone who watched understood the true purpose. The Corthans were coming to silence the truth by force. Palmer received the news with a grim expression. The Hopeful Dawn was a medical frigate with minimal weapons and a crew trained for healing, not combat. Against a Corthan battle fleet, they would not survive 5 minutes. She contacted Admiral Vance on Earth and asked for instructions. Vance told her that Earth was sending reinforcements, but they would not arrive in time. She asked Palmer to consider withdrawing before the Corthan fleet arrived. But she also said that the decision was Palmer's to make. Whatever she chose, Earth would support her. Palmer looked at the crew around her. She looked at Cruz, who was still working to develop a cure. She looked at Webb, who had become a beloved figure among the Velrani children. She looked at Myra, whose recordings had already changed so many minds across the galaxy. And she knew that she could not leave. She addressed her crew and explained the situation honestly. She told them that a Corthan fleet was coming and that they had little chance of survival if they stayed. She said that anyone who wanted to evacuate would be given a shuttle and safe passage off the planet. There would be no shame in leaving. Not a single member of her crew moved. Instead, they looked back at her with determined expressions and said they would stay. Cruz said he was too close to finding a cure to stop now. Webb said the children needed him. And the others simply said that running away was not something humans did. Palmer felt pride swelling in her chest as she looked at these ordinary people who had chosen to be extraordinary. She thanked them and began preparing what defenses they could manage. But humanity was not the only species that had been watching the broadcasts. On the planet Drexa, a warrior named Captain Yeneth sat in his quarters aboard a military cruiser and stared at the screen before him. He had watched Myra's recordings dozens of times. He had seen the evidence that Cruz had presented. And he had remembered something that his grandmother had told him. When he was a child, his grandmother had been born with a disease that should have killed her before she could walk. But a Velrani healer had traveled to Drexa and treated her for free, asking nothing in return. That healer had given his grandmother 60 more years of life. She had raised children and grandchildren, taught and loved and contributed to her community. All because Avarani had been kind. Yeneth had never forgotten that story. And now he watched as the descendants of those same healers were dying while his government did nothing. Worse than nothing. His government was part of the system that had allowed the massacre to happen. He made a decision that would change his life forever. He went to his crew and told them what he intended to do. He said he was going to take his ship to Valorum Prime and stand with the humans. He told them that this would make him a traitor in the eyes of the Drexery government. He said that anyone who did not want to share that fate should leave now. Half his crew left. The other half stayed. And Captain Yeneth set course for Valorum Prime. He was not the only one. Across the galaxy, small ships began changing course. A medical transport from a species called the Fanari, whose world had been saved from famine by Volrane agricultural knowledge. A courier vessel crewed by Yenish merchants who remembered Vilrani traders as the only outsiders who had ever dealt with them fairly. A retired warship operated by survivors of a species that no longer had a homeworld. Refugees who had once been given shelter by the Velrani when no one else would take them. One by one, these ships arrived in the space above Valorum Prime. They were not a fleet. They were barely a squadron. Many of them had no weapons at all. But they came anyway, because they remembered what the Volrani had done for them. And they were ashamed that they had forgotten for so long. Lieutenant Palmer watched in amazement as the ships gathered around the hopeful dawn. She had expected to face the Corthans alone. Instead, she found herself at the center of a growing alliance of the forgotten and the grateful. Captain Yeneth contacted her and introduced himself. He explained why he had come and asked to coordinate with her forces. Palmer welcomed him with tears in her eyes and said that humanity was honored to stand beside those who chose to remember. Meanwhile, on the surface of Valorum Prime, Myra brought news of the gathering fleet to Elder Corvith. The old Velrani listened in silence, and when she finished, he closed his eyes and wept. He said that for 30 years, he had believed the galaxy had no conscience. He had believed that power and self-interest ruled the stars without challenge. But now he saw that there were still those who valued honor and gratitude. There were still those who believed that kindness should be repaid with kindness. On the Corthan homeworld, Ambassador Thelius received reports of the ships gathering at Valorum Prime. He dismissed them as insignificant. A handful of small vessels could not stand against the might of the Corthan Navy. The mission would proceed as planned. But then something unexpected happened. The classified documents that crews had found were not the only evidence of Corthan involvement in the plague. There was more hidden in archives that even the government did not know existed. And someone inside the Corthan system had decided to reveal it. Thelius was in the middle of a council meeting when his personal communication device activated. A message appeared on the screen, sent from an anonymous source. The message contained files that showed the full extent of the conspiracy. Not just the creation of the plague, but the bribes paid to officials in other governments to ensure their cooperation. The threats made against species that questioned the quarantine. The systematic suppression of any investigation into what had really happened. Thelius stared at the screen in horror. He knew immediately who must have sent it. There were only a few officials with access to these files, and most of them were in this room. One of his own people had betrayed him. The files were not just sent to Thelius. They were broadcast across every network in the galaxy at the same moment. Within hours, every being with access to a communication device knew the full truth about what the Corthan Empire had done. The Corthan government fell into chaos. Citizens who had trusted their leaders now demanded justice. Allied species who had followed Corthan leadership now questioned everything. And the fleet that had been sent to silence, the truth suddenly found itself without clear orders. Above Valorum Prime, the defenders watched and waited. They did not know what would happen when the Corthan fleet arrived. They only knew that they would not run. They would stand together, humans and aliens united by a shared belief that some things were more important than survival. Myra continued recording. She wanted future generations to see this moment, to understand what it meant when ordinary beings chose to be brave. She wanted them to know that the galaxy was not just a place of politics and power. It was also a place where compassion could still triumph over cruelty. The Corthan fleet emerged from faster-than-light travel and took position in the space above Velaran Prime. Dozens of warships faced the ragged collection of vessels that had come to defend a dying world. For a long moment, nothing happened. The entire galaxy held its breath, and then the Corthan fleet commander did something no one expected. He opened a communication channel to Lieutenant Palmer and asked her what would happen if his fleet stood down. Palmer told him the truth. She said that Earth wanted justice, not war. She said that if the Corthans were willing to face the consequences of their actions, humanity would advocate for a fair trial instead of vengeance. The commander was silent for a long time. Then he said that he had read the documents. He had seen the evidence. The discovery that the plague was engineered changed everything. Dr. Nathan Cruz had not slept in 2 days, and his eyes were red with exhaustion as he stared at the data scrolling across his screen. But he could not rest. Not now. Not when the truth was finally within reach. Lieutenant Palmer stood beside him in the cramped laboratory aboard the Hopeful Dawn, watching as Cruz compared genetic sequences and ran simulations. She had already sent a classified report to Earth, and the response from Admiral Patricia Vance had been immediate. The Admiral told them to continue their investigation and promised that Earth would stand behind them no matter what they found. Mira was present as well, recording everything with trembling hands. The implications of what Cruz had discovered were almost too horrible to accept. If the plague had been created deliberately, then the Galactic Concorde's quarantine was not an act of cowardice. It was part of a cover-up. Elder Corvith arrived at the ship after being summoned by Palmer. His old body was weak from the journey, but his mind was as sharp as ever. When he heard what Cruz had found, his expression did not show surprise. Instead, it showed the look of someone whose worst suspicions had been confirmed. Palmer asked him if he had suspected this all along. Corvith was quiet for a moment before answering. He explained that 30 years ago, when the plague first appeared, some Velarani scientists had questioned its origin. They had noticed strange things about the disease, patterns that seemed too perfect to be natural. But those scientists had all died in the early waves of infection, and their research had been lost. Cruz asked Corvith if he could think of any reason why someone would want to destroy the Velarani. Corvith nodded slowly and began to tell them a story that Mira had never heard before. Long ago, he explained, the Velarani had developed medical technology that was far beyond anything else in the galaxy. They could cure diseases that other species considered incurable. They could heal injuries that should have been fatal. This knowledge made the Velarani respected and loved throughout the stars. Ships came from every corner of the galaxy seeking treatment, and the Velarani helped everyone equally, asking nothing in return except friendship. But this generosity created problems. Other species began to depend on the Velarani for their health care. Governments that had invested heavily in their own medical research found themselves competing with a species that gave away its cures for free. And some powers in the galaxy began to see the Velarani not as healers, but as a threat to their control. Corvith paused and looked at Palmer with ancient, tired eyes. He said that the Velarani had always known they had enemies, but they had never imagined those enemies would go so far. They had never imagined that anyone could hate kindness enough to destroy an entire civilization for practicing it. Cruz returned to his data and began searching for more specific clues. He found genetic markers in the plague that matched biotechnology known to be used by several species in the Galactic Concorde. But one set of markers appeared more frequently than the others. The technology was KOR than. Palmer felt a cold anger building in her chest. The Korthans had been the loudest voices demanding the quarantine. They had threatened humanity just days ago for helping the Velrani. And now it appeared they might have been responsible for the plague all along. She contacted Admiral Vance on Earth and presented the evidence. The Admiral listened carefully and then asked what Palmer wanted to do. Palmer said she wanted to broadcast their findings to every corner of the galaxy. She wanted every species to know what had been done to the Velrani and who was responsible. Vance warned her that this would make humanity a target. The Korthans and their allies would not accept such an accusation without retaliation. The consequences for Earth could be severe. But then the Admiral smiled and said that sometimes the right thing to do was also the dangerous thing. She told Palmer to proceed with the broadcast. Mira watched as Palmer recorded a message that would be sent across every communication channel the humans could reach. Palmer spoke clearly and calmly, presenting the evidence that Cruz had gathered. She showed the genetic analysis that proved the plague was engineered. She showed the markers that pointed to Korthan technology. And she asked a simple question that echoed across the stars. Why did the galaxy abandon the Velrani so quickly and so completely? The broadcast ended with Palmer stating that humanity would not leave Velrun Prime until the truth was known and justice was served. She invited any species that believed in honesty and compassion to join them. And she warned the Korthan Empire that their secrets were no longer safe. Within hours, the galaxy exploded with response. Some species expressed outrage at the accusations. The Korthans denied everything and accused humanity of spreading lies. But others began asking their own questions. Old records were examined. Forgotten testimonies were retrieved. And slowly, the pieces of a terrible puzzle began to come together. On Velrun Prime, Mira played the broadcast for the remaining Velrani who were strong enough to watch. She saw tears streaming down blue faces as her people finally learned the truth about what had been done to them. It was not bad luck that had destroyed their world. It was murder, and the galaxy had helped cover it up. Elder Corvith addressed his people that night. His voice was stronger than it had been in years, fueled by a righteous anger that burned away his exhaustion. He told them that for 30 years, they had believed they were abandoned because they were not important enough to save. But now they knew the truth. They had been abandoned because powerful forces wanted them dead, and the galaxy had been too weak or too corrupt to stop it. But Corvith also spoke of hope. He pointed to the humans who had come without being asked and stayed despite every threat. He reminded his people that even in the darkest times, there were still those who chose to be good. And he promised that the Velrani would survive. They would rebuild, and they would never forget who had stood by them when no one else would, on Earth. Admiral Vance faced a council of angry diplomats from a dozen species. They demanded that she recall the hopeful dawn and issue an apology to the Korthan Empire. They warned of trade sanctions and political isolation. They spoke of consequences that would damage humanity for generations. Vance listened to all of it with a calm expression. When they finished speaking, she stood and addressed them directly. She said that humanity had joined the galactic community, hoping to find wisdom and friendship among the stars. Instead, they found a conspiracy to commit genocide and a system designed to protect the guilty. She said that if the price of remaining in good standing with such a community was silence in the face of murder, then humanity would pay a different price. She told them that Earth would continue to support the mission on Velrun Prime. She said that humanity would pursue the truth no matter where it led. And she warned them that anyone who threatened human ships or personnel would learn that Earth was small but not weak, young but not foolish. The diplomats left in anger, and Vance knew that difficult times were ahead for humanity. But she also knew that her species had faced difficult times before. They had survived wars and plagues and disasters of their own making. They had learned hard lessons about the cost of looking away when evil happened. And they had decided, as a civilization, that some things were more important than comfort and safety. Back on Valoran Prime, Dr. Cruz continued his work. The evidence he had gathered was damning, but he wanted more. He wanted proof that could not be denied or explained away. He spent days searching through Velrain medical archives that had survived the plague, looking for anything that might help Dot, and then he found it. Deep in the records, he discovered communications from 30 years ago. Messages between Corthan officials discussing the Velrani problem and proposing solutions. References to a biological project with no official name. And finally, a single document that outlined the entire plan. The creation of a targeted plague, the manipulation of the Galactic Concord to enforce a quarantine, and the systematic destruction of a species whose only crime was being too generous. Cruz brought the evidence to Palmer, and together they prepared a second broadcast. This one would contain proof that even the Corthans could not deny. This one would change the galaxy forever. 3 weeks had passed since the humans landed on Valoran Prime, and the world had begun to change in small but meaningful ways. Where there had once been silence and despair, there was now the constant sound of activity. Humans in protective suits moved between tents and buildings, carrying supplies and helping the sick. The smell of medicine had replaced the smell of decay. Myra followed Dr. Nathan Cruz through the largest of the 3 field hospitals the humans had built. She carried her recording device in one hand and a translation tablet in the other, serving as both historian and guide for the human doctor. Cruz was a tall man with tired eyes and gentle hands. He had not slept more than a few hours each night since arriving, and yet he never complained. He simply moved from patient to patient, examining them, taking samples, and speaking soft words of comfort. She asked him a question that had been on her mind for days. She wanted to know why he had volunteered for this mission when he surely knew it might kill him. Cruz stopped walking and thought about the question for a moment. Then he told her about a custom from human history called the Hippocratic Oath. He explained that doctors on Earth promised to help the sick wherever they found them, without considering politics or borders or personal safety. He said it was a promise that humans had been making for thousands of years, and he was not about to break it now. Myra did not fully understand all the words he used, but she understood the feeling behind them. She understood that this human had come to her dying world because his conscience would not let him stay away. They continued through the hospital and came to the section where the youngest patients were being treated. Velrani children lay on beds that the humans had brought, their pale blue skin made paler by sickness. Among them walked Corporal Danny Webb, a young human with a round face and a quick smile. He was not a doctor. Mira had learned that his job was to carry equipment and assist the medical staff. But whenever he had free time, he came to the children. Webb sat beside a small Velrani girl and held up a colorful ball that he had made from scraps of material. He tossed it gently to her, and she caught it with weak fingers. A small smile appeared on her face, the first smile Myra had seen on a Velrani child in longer than she could remember. Webb cheered softly and encouraged her to throw it back. Language was a barrier between them, but kindness needed no translation. Dr. Cruz watched this scene with a warm expression and told Myra that Webb had lost his own younger sister to illness many years ago. He said that was why Webb had joined the medical corps. He wanted to make sure other children did not suffer the way his sister had suffered. Myra recorded every moment. She knew that her people needed to see this. They needed to know that the humans who had come to save them were not heroes from some distant legend, but ordinary people who had chosen to be extraordinary. Later that day, Lieutenant Palmer received a communication from outside the system. Mira was present in the command tent when the message came through, and she saw the expression on Palmer's face shift from calm to concerned. The message was from Ambassador Thelius of the Corthan Empire. The ambassador's face appeared on the screen, his features sharp and his eyes cold. The Corthans were one of the most powerful species in the Galactic Concord. They had been among the first to abandon the Velry 30 years ago, and they had been the loudest voices calling for the quarantine. Thelius spoke in a measured tone, but his words carried an unmistakable threat. He told Palmer that humanity was making a grave mistake. He explained that the Galactic Concord had declared Velrun Prime a forbidden zone for good reason. Any species that violated the quarantine would face consequences. He warned that humanity was young and small, and could not afford to make enemies of the established powers. Palmer listened to the entire message without interrupting. When Thelius finished speaking, she was quiet for a moment. Then she responded in a voice that was polite but firm. She thanked the ambassador for his concern and assured him that humanity had considered the risks. Before coming to Velrun Prime, she said that humans could not simply watch a civilization die when they had the power to help. She told him that political consequences were a price her people were willing to pay. Thelius seemed surprised by her answer. He leaned forward and reminded her that the Corthans controlled many of the trade routes that human ships used. He said that defying the Concord would isolate humanity from galactic commerce. He asked if she truly understood what she was giving up. Palmer nodded and said she understood perfectly. She told him that trade and profit meant nothing to humans if they had to step over the bodies of innocent people to get them. She said that Earth would survive economic hardship, but it would not survive becoming the kind of civilization that abandoned the helpless. Then she ended the communication. Myra stared at the human lieutenant with a mixture of shock and admiration. She had just witnessed a member of the youngest species in the galaxy tell one of the oldest and most powerful empires that their threats meant nothing. She asked Palmer if she was not afraid of what the Corthans might do. Palmer smiled and admitted that she was very afraid. But she said that fear was not a good enough reason to do the wrong thing. She explained that humans had a long history of being afraid and doing the right thing anyway. She said it was one of the few things about her species that she was truly proud of. That night, Mira sat with Elder Corvith in the archive chamber and played him the recording of the exchange between Palmer and Thelius. The old Velrani listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When the recording ended, he sat quietly for a long time. Finally, he spoke. He said that in all his years of studying galactic politics, he had never seen anything like what he had just witnessed. He explained that every species in the Concord calculated power and interest and advantage. They made decisions based on what would benefit them most. Even the species that had once been friends of the Velrani had abandoned them when the cost of friendship became too high. But these humans were different. They had nothing to gain from helping the Velrani. They were risking their political future, their economic prosperity, and their very lives. And when threatened by one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy, they had simply refused to leave. Corvith told Myra that he had been wrong about the humans. He had thought they were naive children who did not understand how the galaxy worked. But now he saw that they understood perfectly. They simply refused to accept it. They had looked at the cold, calculating nature of galactic politics and decided that they would be something different. Something better. Myra asked what they should do now. Corvith thought about the question and then said they should do what the humans were doing. They should hope. They should fight. And they should remember that even in the darkest times, there were still beings in the universe who believed that compassion was more important than power. The next morning, Dr. Cruz called an emergency meeting in the medical command center. His face was pale and his hands were shaking slightly as he pointed to the display screen before him. He had been analyzing samples from dozens of Volrani patients, searching for a way to fight the plague. What he had found was not a cure. What he had found was something far more disturbing. The plague was not natural. Someone had created it. Cruz explained that the genetic structure of the disease was too precise, too targeted, to have evolved on its own. It had been engineered specifically to attack Volrani biology while leaving other species untouched. The plague that had killed billions of Volrani and brought their civilization to its knees was a weapon. Myra felt the room spin around her. All her life, she had believed that her people had simply been unlucky, that nature had struck them with a terrible disease. But now she was learning that someone had murdered her world on purpose. Someone had looked at the Volrani, a peaceful species known throughout the galaxy for their healing knowledge, and decided to destroy them. Palmer asked who could have done such a thing. Prue shook his head and said he did not know yet, but he promised that he would find out. And when he did, the galaxy would learn the truth. Mira Odom sat alone in the archive chamber, her pale blue fingers moving across the recording device that had become her only companion. The walls around her were cracked and stained with age, and the once beautiful carvings that told the history of her people had faded into shadows. She pressed the button and began to speak, her voice carrying the weight of 30 years of suffering. She told the story that every Volrani child learned before they could walk. The story of the Great Abandonment. 30 years ago, when the plague first appeared on Velran Prime, the galaxy had watched with concern. The Korthan Empire sent messages of sympathy. The Dressari Collective offered prayers to their gods. The Yenish Federation expressed deep sorrow. And then, one by one, they all closed their borders and turned their ships away. Myra had been born into a dying world. She had never known the Velran Prime that her grandmother described. The world of healing centers that welcomed patients from 100 species. The world of scholars who freely shared their knowledge with anyone who asked. That world was gone now. The plague had taken most of her people, and isolation had taken the rest of their hope. Elder Corvith entered the archive chamber slowly, his old body bent from years of carrying grief. He looked at Mira with eyes that had seen too much loss and shook his head gently. Another day of silence from the stars. Another day of being forgotten. But today would be different. The communication device in the corner of the room suddenly came to life with a sound that neither of them had heard in decades. An incoming signal. Mira jumped from her seat and rushed to the screen, her heart beating fast in her chest. Corvith moved behind her, his expression shifting from surprise to suspicion. A face appeared on the screen. It was an alien, but not one of the species that had abandoned them. This face was softer, with strange round eyes and skin the color of warm sand. A human. Mira had studied humans in the old records. They were a young species, barely a century into space travel. The galaxy considered them unimportant, children playing among the stars. The human woman on the screen smiled gently and spoke in careful, clear words that the translation device could easily understand. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Grace Palmer of the medical frigate, Hopeful Dawn. She explained that they had picked up old distress signals from Velran Prime while passing through a nearby system. She asked for permission to land and offer assistance. Corvith pushed past Mira and spoke directly into the device. His voice was rough with anger and old pain. He told the human that they were not welcome. He said that the galaxy had made its choice 30 years ago, and no one would trick the Volrani with false hope now. He accused the humans of coming to pick through the bones of a dying civilization like scavengers. Lieutenant Palmer did not seem offended by his words. Her expression remained calm and kind. She said she understood his anger and that she would feel the same way if she had been abandoned by those she trusted. But she explained that humans had not been part of that decision. They had not even been members of the Galactic Concord 30 years ago. They were here now because they had received a cry for help, and humans did not ignore such things. Corvus laughed bitterly and asked what one small human ship could possibly do for a planet of the dying. Palmer replied that they had doctors and medicine and equipment. She said they might not be able to save everyone, but they would try to save as many as they could. She asked nothing in return. She only asked for the chance to help. Myra felt something strange in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it because she had not felt it since she was a small child. It was hope. Dangerous, painful hope. Corvus shook his head and warned Palmer about the plague. He told her that it was death to set foot on Velrum Prime. Any species that came here would catch the disease and die. The Galactic Concord had declared their world forbidden for good reason. The humans would be throwing their lives away. Palmer nodded and said she understood the risk. She explained that her crew had volunteered for this mission, knowing the danger. She said they had protective equipment and quarantine procedures. But even if those failed, even if they caught the plague and died, at least they would die trying to help, instead of living with the knowledge that they had done nothing. Corvus fell silent. He had no response to such words. In all his long years, he had never heard an outsider speak this way. The species of the Galactic Concord had calculated risks and political costs and made the logical choice to protect themselves. This human was speaking of something else entirely. She was speaking of values that Corvus had thought existed only in the old stories of his own people. Myra stepped forward and spoke before Corvus could refuse again. She welcomed the humans to Velrum Prime. Corvus turned to look at her with shock and disapproval, but she met his gaze without backing down. She told him that their people were dying anyway. If these humans were lying, nothing would change. But if they were telling the truth, then this might be the only chance the Velrani would ever have. The elder closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, he looked older than ever before. He nodded slowly and gave his permission for the humans to land. 1 hour later, Mira stood at the edge of the old landing field with a small group of Velrani who were healthy enough to walk. They watched the sky with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The clouds parted and a ship descended through them, a small vessel painted white with a red symbol on its side that looked like a cross. The ship landed gently on the cracked stone of the field. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the doors opened and humans began to emerge. But they were not ordinary humans. They wore sealed suits that covered their entire bodies, with clear helmets that showed their faces. They carried boxes and equipment that Myra did not recognize. A woman stepped forward and removed her helmet despite the warnings being shouted by her crew members. She had brown hair cut short and kind eyes that seemed to carry no fear. She approached Corvus and bowed her head in a gesture of respect. Lieutenant Grace Palmer introduced herself and her crew. She said they had brought doctors, nurses, and medical supplies. She explained that their ship carried enough equipment to set up 3 field hospitals. She admitted that they did not know if they could cure the plague, but they promised to work every hour of every day until they found a way. Corvus asked her the question that had been burning in his mind since her first message. He asked why. Why would humans travel across the stars to help a species they had never met? Why would they risk their lives for strangers? Palmer smiled and said something that Mira would remember for the rest of her life. She said that a very long time ago, on their home planet, humans had learned that the measure of a civilization was not how it treated the powerful, but how it treated the forgotten. She said her people had not always lived up to that ideal, but they were trying to be better. And leaving a dying world to suffer alone was not something they could do, and still call themselves human. Mira felt tears forming in her large, sensitive eyes. She began recording everything with her device, knowing that whatever happened next, this moment needed to be preserved. For the first time in 30 years, someone had come. Someone had chosen to remember the VEL Ronnie. The humans spread out across the landing field and began unpacking their equipment. Dr. Nathan Cruz, the chief medical officer, was already asking questions about the symptoms of the plague and the treatments that had been tried. Corporal Danny Webb was handing out small packages of food to the Velrani children, who had gathered to stare at the strange visitors. Elder Corvith watched all of this with an expression that slowly changed from suspicion to wonder. He turned to Mira and said quietly that perhaps he had lived long enough to see something he never expected. Perhaps he had lived long enough to see hope return to Valorum Prime.